Hello, I'm Marianne Clark. I'm the Administrative Director at the Lobero Theatre, and I'm delighted to be here this evening to hear Brett talk about one of my favorite topics. I may be a little biased. I would guess that 5 years ago, Brett had no idea that he would become the Lobero's official historian. He joined our board in 2019 and very quickly was asked and accepted the position of chair of the Ovation campaign, which was set to celebrate the Lobero's 150th birthday and to raise some much needed endowment funds. That was a very successful campaign, by the way, but we were just in the planning phases of that campaign when COVID shut our doors and everybody else's in March of 2020. So like other arts organizations, we were looking for unique ways to remain a relevant resource and to become sort of a digital meeting place for the community. Brett had this wonderful idea to write a history series called Intermission, written entirely by him and highlighting past events on the Lobero stage going all the way back to the late 1800s. One of our major donors thought it was a great idea too and agreed to fund it, and the rest, as they say, is history. Sorry, pun very much intended. Brett has since scoured the collections here at the museum, the UCSB collection UCSB archives for the Lobero Theatre, and the vast reaches of the internet to find just so many fascinating Lobero stories. He has produced 2 films, as Dacia referenced, about Lobero history. He also helped produce a film about the Ovation campaign that helped us to raise all those funds. And I have to say, his work continues to this day. In the past 2 weeks alone, we've received archival documents from Brett about 3 totally different Lobero history items. So he sort of never stops, and we love that about him. I will say on behalf of the Lobero board and staff that we are extremely grateful that Brett has such an intense curiosity about Santa Barbara's stories. He's a truly talented researcher and historian, and I know you're really going to enjoy tonight's presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dacia and Marianne. And thank you for inviting me to share the Lobero's amazing story with you all here tonight. When I joined the Lobero board a few years ago, I somehow stepped into the role of unofficial, official historian. I'm not sure which. And it's been so much fun. The first project that I thought, oh, wouldn't this be a fun thing to do, would be to try to chronicle every event which has happened at the Lobero in 150 years. And I think I figured it would take, maybe 6 months to pull this off. So here we are, 4 years later. I'm still doing it when I have the time. I think I've documented around 20,000 performances. And what's fun for me, I'm sort of a nerd. For each event, I'm documenting the genre, subgenre, whether or not it was done by amateur locals or professionals, the headliner gender. So I think eventually it's going to be fun to turn this over to somebody and say, hey, produce an infographic that shows how genres of popular entertainment change by decade. And it's going to be, it's predictably going to be sort of an interesting evolution. Last year, the Lobero turned 150 years old, which is really, really special. The Lobero is the 4th oldest continuous performing arts theater in the country. Yeah, really. After two theaters in Philadelphia, the Walnut Street Theater and the Academy of Music, and the Pabst Theater in Milwaukee. But even more significantly, I think, the performers who've appeared on that little stage, it's just one block from here, over a century and a half, make the Lobero one of our nation's most important cultural venues. I think everything I've learned in the course of my research can be summed up in one sentence, and that is, the story of the Lobero is the story of Santa Barbara. Lobero has been ground central for so many important events and trends in Santa Barbara history over 150 years that I think a very good argument can be made for it being one of our city's most influential institutions. Yeah. Our story begins around 1850 when a 27-year-old Italian trombone player named Giuseppe Lobero steps off a ship in San Francisco, came from Genoa, Italy, and we're not sure if he came to San Francisco in hopes of actually finding gold or simply to provide musical entertainment. But whatever the reason, things must not have worked out exactly as he'd hoped, because by the late 1850s, Lobero has moved down to Santa Barbara and changed his first name to Jose. Clever branding move, I'd say. This is a really interesting drawing from 1856 that Neil Graffey shared with me. This is Santa Barbara in 1856. You'll see the Mission up on the hill on the left, and that's it. That's downtown. I guess we're not quite seeing the Presidio, but you'll realize from this how tiny Santa Barbara was in the 1850s. Santa Barbara in the 1850s and 1860s was a very small, isolated, rough and tumble, small city. This is a panoramic photograph from the 1870s, which I think was probably the first time photographs of the city were done. Some of you have probably seen this photograph before. This is a view up State Street. It shows you see the track for the mule-drawn trolley. Streets were still dirt. Sidewalks were wooden planks. Lighting was provided by gas lamps. Whenever I look at this photograph, the two animals standing in the middle of the street, I presume are dogs, but the one in the middle sort of looks like a goat to me, which I think is entirely possible in Santa Barbara in 1850. This is a photo of the mule-drawn trolley. At this time, Santa Barbara was undergoing a critical transition from the original Spanish-speaking Californios to a new Anglo majority. Spanish was still the official language for all public records, and our first newspaper, the Gazette, was published in both English and Spanish. By 1860, the population of Santa Barbara had reached 2,351, and Jose Lobero had opened the Brewery Saloon, which was located on the corner of Canyon Perdido and State Streets. The first public mention we have of Jose Lobero comes in a newspaper that records a New Year's Day stabbing in 1860 that happened at the saloon. I haven't been able to research this as much as I'd like, but Don Jose Carrillo, who was the attacker, was 18 years old, and I think it's safe to presume was a member of the prominent Carrillo family. I haven't been able to figure out what happened, what the result of this was. Even though Lobero was a saloon keeper, his true love was music, and he organized the Santa Barbara Brass Band, which played at local funerals and marched in parades. And I don't think he's pictured in this photograph, unfortunately. Oops, let's go back, sorry. This is the first photograph we have of Jose Lobero. It's from about 1870, and he's probably in his mid-40s. In the years after the end of the Civil War, every town in America felt it needed to have an opera house in order to be seen as legitimate and to literally be on the map. And Santa Barbara was obviously no different. This map is interesting from about 1872. You'll notice that Ventura County is missing. Ventura County didn't exist until 1873 when it was split off from Santa Barbara County. Lobero had dreams of introducing California to grand Italian opera, and amazingly, with the financial help of Colonel William Hollister, he began reconstructing a huge old adobe schoolhouse, which is the building colored with the red colored roof. It was called the Sebastopol School on the corner of Canyon Perdido and Anacapa Streets, and he began converting it into an opera house. And a funny anecdote: Colonel William Hollister, we've always heard of. He was a very big name in our town. Was never actually in the military, and Colonel was just a childhood nickname, which he encouraged people to call him by as an adult. Pretty ingenious way of garnering more respect. The theater construction took 3 years and cost $60,000, and it officially opened on George Washington's birthday, which was February 22nd, 1873. There were 800 people in attendance at the theater, which was a quarter of the city's population. And for the opening act, Lobero had choreographed, written, and composed an Italian operetta, and he also took the main singing role. He was sort of a Renaissance man when it came to music. The Lobero Opera House was only the second opera house in California and the only one outside of San Francisco. This is a photo from the 1870s. There's nothing, or actually from the 1880s, there's nothing from the 1870s, but you'll notice that even in the 1880s, the streets were still dirt, mud when it rained. State Street is at the far left with that 3-story building. For years and years, for about a decade, Los Angeles was tremendously jealous of Santa Barbara. There were editorials in the Los Angeles papers saying things like, Santa Barbara has the building without the people. We have the people without the building. They went crazy. And I don't understand, but they didn't get a comparable opera house until the mid-1880s, 10 years after Santa Barbara. From the very beginning, however, it was apparent that the opera house was a huge business gamble. The theater could hold as many as 1,300 people, but the city of Santa Barbara had less than 3,000 residents. I think from that you sort of get a sense of Lobero's hubris. I mean, he really had some grandiosity in him. Another challenge was location. Even though it was just 1 block off of State Street, which is a 3-story building, it was located in Chinatown, which was considered to be an undesirable part of town, especially at night. Nevertheless, as soon as it opened, the Lobero became the heart and center of Santa Barbara's cultural and political life. In July 1873, just a few months after the theater opened, it hosted Santa Barbara's first bipartisan citizens convention. At the meeting, the county assessor released statistics on the county, and it's sort of mind-boggling. The assessor team went out, counted every building, every fruit tree, every beehive, every horse, every cow. And the total value of everything in Santa Barbara came to around $5 million. And then this is sort of interesting. You'll see that in 1873, sheep were overwhelmingly the most prevalent livestock in the county. And 150 years later, I don't think you could find a flock of sheep if you drove up to Koyama. This is a photo of the inside of the opera house, and you'll notice that it had a big balcony. Looking at the calendar of events at American opera houses like the Lobero in the late 1800s is a really strange experience. And that's because acts were often booked for their racial and ethnic novelty and curiosity value. and audiences could be incredibly rude. This is an editorial from the Daily Press. Catcalling, shrieking, smoking, half-grown rude boys apparently disrupted many performances. The cheap seats were up in the balcony, and these kids, these young men, their favorite pastime was to chew tobacco, lean over the balcony, spit it down on the audience below them, throw peanuts down on the audience or peanuts up on the stage. The Lobero Opera House days were when all the wild and crazy stuff went on, completely politically incorrect by today's standards. There were raucous vaudeville and minstrel shows, charlatan faith healers like the boy wizard, the world's invincible magnetic healer. There's a funny account in the newspaper about one of his performances. He set up shop for like a week at a time. And at one of these performances, an old man comes into the theater on crutches, can barely make his way down to his seat. And then after being touched by this magnetic healer, the boy wonder, he lifts up his crutches, sings and dances his way out of the theater. You know, if he was a plant, he might have been a plant. It might have been, an example of some sort of spontaneous placebo healing that didn't last very long, but the newspapers they loved reporting on it. One night a seance would be held on stage, and then the next night there might be someone debunking spiritualism and showing how all the spirit manifestations, the table knocking, the bugle blowing, could be done just with, stage magic illusions. When it came to theater, audiences wanted simple plots, and the Lobero calendar was packed with melodramas. Melodramas had sensational plots and exaggerated characters. The good were very, very good, and the bad were sinisterly evil. In the 1880s, there was a national roller skating craze that I never imagined. And all of the seats were removed from the theater. They were all portable to begin with, and the whole thing became a big skating rink. And the skating season lasted like 2 months. And at the end of the grand finale of the season was a costume ball skating event. The brass band was up on stage playing. People were wearing costumes, racing around, drinking alcohol, dim gas light. It would have been hilarious to have witnessed. And during the Opera House days, there was actually some opera, or more accurately, light opera. Gilbert and Sullivan were perennial favorites. On August 19, 1887, the railroad finally arrived in Santa Barbara from the south, and our town was never the same again. Up until this time, travelers coming from the south had two options: 6-passenger stagecoaches, which actually had to traverse portions of the beach at low tide in sections between Ventura and Santa Barbara, or steamer ships, which docked at the newly built Stearns Wharf, which opened in 1872, the year the Lobero unofficially opened. The railroad changed everything. Not only was it a boon to local businesses and hotels, but really famous people started coming to Santa Barbara, largely to appear on the Lobero Opera House stage. There's so many colorful characters and stories from the Opera House days, it's hard to select just a few to highlight. But I found a few from the 1890s, which I think capture the spirit of the time and show how different Santa Barbara and America were at the end of the 19th century. In June of 1891, arguably the most famous person to ever appear in Santa Barbara arrived at the Chapala Street train station. I say arguably because a few months earlier, President Benjamin Harrison had actually visited Santa Barbara, but I think it's safe to say that this fellow would have been more well-known to the average person on the street, more idolized than even a president. And it was John L. Sullivan, who was a 33-year-old bare-knuckle boxer known as the Boston Strong Boy. Sullivan had a record of 42 wins and no losses, and 2 years earlier had won the last bare-knuckle boxing title fight, an incredible 75-round, 2.5-hour fight held outdoors in the heat in Mississippi against a guy named Jack Kilrain. The Sullivan-Kilrain fight was the first sporting event to be widely covered by the media, and it made Sullivan a national hero. He was said to be the second most widely known American after Ulysses S. Grant. In 1890, understandably ready to cash in on his celebrity status and probably hoping to preserve a few remaining brain cells, he embarked on a national tour of a melodrama called Honest Hearts and Willing Hands. Sullivan played a blacksmith and apparently was a very stiff, awkward, terrible actor. But the Lobero audience went wild during the play's finale when he takes off his shirt and he beats up the play's nefarious bully. Sullivan died at the age of 60 in 1918, and one obituary said that he claimed to have earned $2 million in his boxing career and to have spent $1 million of it buying drinks for himself and his host of admirers. In 1892, one of the most fascinating global celebrities of the 19th century appeared on the Lobero Opera House stage. Lavinia Warren was a petite entertainer who rose to fame under the promotion and exploitation of Phineas T. Barnum. Lavinia Warren was the widow of Charles Stratton, who's better known by his stage name of Tom Thumb. And Lavinia and Charles's story is really mind-boggling by today's standards, and I think perfectly represents how different America was in the 19th century. In 1843, P.T. Barnum was reading a newspaper and read about a Connecticut boy named Charles Sherwood Stratton who had stopped growing at the age of 7 months, which today it would be called it's a condition known as proportional dwarfism. Barnum promptly paid a visit to the Stratton home and incredibly convinced the child's parents to let Barnum become the boy's manager and guardian, take him away from his parents. Barnum taught young Charles to act, sing, dance, and tell stories, as well as smoke cigars and drink wine. He's 5 years old. And when the boy was only 6 years old, took him on a tour of Europe where he met Queen Victoria and became an international celebrity known as General Tom Thumb. In February 1863, Barnum introduced the 25-year-old Charles Stratton to 21-year-old Lavinia Warren, and after a brief courtship, the two were married at a wedding that was promoted by Barnum as the wedding of the century. Following the wedding, the couple were received by President Abraham Lincoln at the White House. And I'm sort of fascinated by this story, and I was reading parts of her autobiography. She complained that all of her life, and she lived to be 78 years old, but all of her life, she said, people treated her as a child, would pat her on the head like she was a little pet. But she wrote that when she and Charles met Abraham and Mary Lincoln, President Lincoln talked to them with complete respect, not condescending at all. And she said it was really remarkable and really, really unusual. And then the story, which is a little strange, she said that President Lincoln picked up Tom Thumb, put him on the couch next to him. Mary Lincoln picks up Lavinia, puts her on the couch for a conversation. And you read that and you go, that's so strange. But she was 2.5 feet tall and weighed 25 pounds. And she said that was the only way they could ever get up on couches. They had to be picked up. Sort of fascinating. 2 years after her husband died at the age of 45, Lavinia returned to show business and formed a troupe composed of other little people in an act called Mrs. General Tom Thumb, the Countess Magri, and the Lilliputians. And she appeared at the Lobero as a benefit for the Santa Barbara's free kindergarten. Events of great societal importance also took place at the Lobero during the Opera House days. It wasn't all just sort of novelty acts. From the 1890s to the 1910s, the Lobero was an important venue for the women's suffrage movement. And really interestingly, rallies, as they called them, were often held in English and Spanish at the same time. On October 17, 1896, the Opera House's 1,300 seats were filled and hundreds were turned away at the door when Susan B. Anthony came to Santa Barbara to speak. Anthony was in Santa Barbara to urge voters, who at the time, of course, were only men, to support California Amendment 6, which would allow women the right to vote. Her Santa Barbara visit was the social and civic event of the year, and it received glowing coverage from both of the Santa Barbara papers, which was quite an accomplishment because they were at different political ends of the spectrum and usually didn't agree on newsworthy items. And interestingly, while the amendment was supported by Santa Barbara male voters, statewide it was resoundingly defeated, and women wouldn't gain the right to vote in California until 1911. Susan B. Anthony's speech represented a momentous political and cultural shift. Another game-changing moment came a year later when Santa Barbara's first moving picture was shown at the Lobero. On July 15, 1897, Thomas Edison's Vitascope projection system had its first showing at the Lobero. Yes, the technology was absolutely amazing, but it was really the content which made history. For reserved seats of 50 cents or cheap seats up in the balcony, 25 cents, audiences were treated to a newsreel of the Corbett-Fitzsimmons fight, and most famously, the kiss. Okay. Trigger alert necessary here. What you're about to see caused moral outrage in many towns across the country. Some newspapers described the film as shocking and obscene, and editorials called for censorship and moral reform. And of course, it was silent. That's it. The very first kiss on film elicited some of the funniest, even if it was unintentional, film criticism ever written. Neither participant is physically attractive, and the spectacle of their prolonged pasturing, I love that, on each other's lips was hard to bear. When only life-sized, it was pronounced beastly, but that was nothing to the present sight. Magnified to gargantuan proportions and repeated 3 times over, it is absolutely disgusting. I looked hard, but I couldn't find any evidence that Santa Barbara was outraged by this film. I think, the kids up in the cheap seats were probably throwing packs of peanuts and yelling and whooping, and I think everybody found it pretty amusing. By the 1910s, with competition from motion pictures and the new Potter Theatre, which had been built on State Street, the Lobero was booking temperance lectures, second-rate vaudeville, and even wrestling matches. They took out all the seats and they put in a wrestling ring in the middle of the theater. And I think Kid Brett is going to beat young Gates. We don't have any photos of the Lobero from the 1870s. This is taken in probably 1920. So this is after the theater is sort of starting to go downhill. And you'll notice that it looks pretty decrepit and even like a fire danger. And then I came across this photo. taken probably a few months later. The wooden staircase on the right has been removed, and you'll notice there's a horse grazing on the weeds next to the building. Were horses just wandering downtown looking for places to graze in the 1920s? I don't quite understand how that happened. And what became of Jose Lobero? Well, unfortunately, the Opera House was never much of a business, and Lobero was frankly a terrible businessman. And in 1885, just 12 years after he opened the theater, he lost it to his creditors, who I believe were the Hollister family. Losing the theater seemed to affect his mental health. He still had his saloon, but he became fixated on finding gold. One of his closest friends in an interview described what was going on. He said, he had a belief in his head that he was going to make his fortune out of gold in the mountains around here. There were lots of men who would prospect in the hills. They made Santa Barbara their headquarters, and they always went to Lobero's saloon. They would tell Jose that they were just about to strike it. They would bring in pieces of rock which showed little flecks of gold. Sometimes I know those flecks were put in there because they shot a golden bullet into the rock. We were an ingenious con. On June 28, 1892, despondent from poor health and finances, he committed suicide. And he was 69 years old. In 1917, the Lobero Opera House went completely dark, but instead of this being the end of our story, it's really just the beginning of a remarkable Act Two. During and just after World War I, there was a movement across America to produce socially relevant, literate amateur theater. A natural response to the devastation of World War I think. People were probably looked back and said, melodramas, vaudeville, that just doesn't satisfy us. We want something more meaningful. It was called the Little Theater Movement, and its West Coast epicenter was the Pasadena Playhouse. This also happened to be a time when Santa Barbara was experiencing a renaissance. Wealthy folk from the Midwest and the East Coast were coming in and building mansions in Montecito. This is Casa del Herrero and the Lotus Land Estate. In 1922, a local group called the Community Arts Association felt that Santa Barbara deserved its own little theater, and they commissioned George Washington Smith's architectural firm to design the building. Lutah Maria Riggs was the chief designer at the firm, and it's her name which appears at the bottom of most of these conceptual renderings for the theater. It's funny how they called it the Little Theater for the Lobero Theater. Lutah Maria Riggs was a fascinating character. She was the first licensed female architect in Santa Barbara and the first woman in California to be named a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. The new Lobero Theater builds on the foundation of the old Opera House, opened in August 1924. This is really the only photograph we have of the pre-opening, and it always makes me laugh. There's no way this group was actually involved in the construction of the theater. I love the way her shoes are just pure lily white after a long day of working in the mud. And this is actually a picture of the first bucket full of dirt for the construction of the new Lobero Theater. The opening of the new Lobero was celebrated with Santa Barbara's first Old Spanish Days Fiesta, and this was intentional. Santa Barbara civic leaders wanted to create an event which would draw summer visitors, and what better excuse than to time it with the opening of Jose Lobero's old theater. All of the minutes and documents from the 1924 first Fiesta are out at UCSB Special Collections, and David and I have gone out and taken a look at some of them. And it's really interesting that you can sort of, there are a lot of clues as to what Santa Barbara was looking for with this first fiesta. The offices were run out of the Lobero Theatre, and the ambitiousness of the first fiesta is sort of insane. There was an aviation committee, there was a sports committee, a beach committee, and then they had a mission statement for the 1924 fiesta was speed, accuracy, courtesy, cooperation. You could use that today, right? Hamilton McFadden was a fellow who was a director at the Lobero, and he was also the chair of the Fiesta's pageant and parade committee. And he was obviously tasked with trying to find groups to participate in the first parade, which sounds like how hard could that have been? But when you start looking at all this paperwork, you realize you look at all the rejection letters. No, thank you. We'd rather not participate. It was a terribly hard task. This is hard to read. It's a letter to the American Legion. It's sort of the form letter asking if they will participate in the parade. At the top, which it is hard to read, is a list of other organizations that he obviously intended to contact. Most are very reasonable. The police department, the fire department. Some of these are groups that no longer exist. Spanish War veterans, the Chinese Nationalist Party, Japanese Association, and unfortunately, you can't see it at the bottom. The list becomes more absurd the further it goes down. And at the bottom, the last handwritten item here, the last group that he wanted to contact is the International Association of Druids. And when I saw this, I thought, oh, somebody has a good sense of humor. But I asked Neil about it and said, oh no, the Druids, they were a group that existed in America. There was a Santa Barbara chapter of Druids. It just imagine, you can picture this, how Druids would have thematically fit into a parade celebrating Santa Barbara's Spanish romantic-sized tradition. Do you give them a float, or do they have a marching band, a Druid marching band? I don't know if they participated, but it shows the links that they were going to. On June 29, 1925, just 10 months after the Lobero opened, Santa Barbara experienced a devastating 6.3 earthquake. 2/3 of the commercial buildings in downtown were damaged, including the upstart Potter Theater, which always sort of makes me chuckle. But the Lobero Theatre remained unscathed. In fact, it was such a safe spot that the city set up a temporary restaurant on Anacapa Street, right next to the theater. Isn't that a great scene? I was curious about this, and I asked Neil, do you think that, yes, was this indeed next to the Lobero Theater? He said, yes, it was. And he even knew the name it was called Johnston's Cafe. There was a name for this temporary restaurant. This photo is interesting. It was taken in about 1924 when the theater opened. So there's a telephone pole, sort of ugly, next to the theater. And here we are a few months later, after the earthquake. Obviously everybody who understands history in Santa Barbara knows that the earthquake was the best thing that ever happened to Santa Barbara. Utilities were undergrounded downtown. And the Lobero and neighboring buildings like El Paseo were so admired after the earthquake, not only for standing up and being, unscathed, but they inspired an architectural board of review, which was established in the city, and which chose Spanish Colonial revival as the theme for rebuilding Santa Barbara. In a very short time, the Lobero Theatre was seen as one of the most important little theaters in America. But the Community Arts Association did something, they were very astute. They realized, I think within a year, that for a theater to be financially viable in a small city like Santa Barbara, it had to offer more than just amateur theater. By 1926, the Lobero had transitioned from an amateur little theater into a venue which was nationally famous for presenting professional theater, dance, and music. For nearly 100 years, the Lobero has been an important jazz venue, and it all started in 1926 when a 23-year-old Bing Crosby took the stage in what was certainly the first and only midnight matinee at the theater. The show started at 11:30 p.m. And he and his high school buddy Al Rinker were part of a 45-member musical review, including 20 Midgie Miller Glorious Dancing Girls. And he was so unknown, he's 23 years old, that you'll see that the Daily News misspelled his name and called him Corsi instead of Crosby. This is a part of their routine that night, as shown in a film a couple of years later.
So the bluebirds and the blackbirds got together. Then the blackbird said, oh, we're birds of a different feather. So the bluebirds and the blackbirds got together. Ba-la-ba-la, ba-la-ba-la. Oh, trouble, trouble round my door. Blackbirds, blackbirds, by the score. Hold up now. Bluebirds, big bluebirds, came one day and said to the blackbirds, here are saved.
So he was about 25 years old in that film. I mean, how amazing. I've looked at that little clip dozens of times, and I just realized I have no idea what they're singing about. It's like some battle between blackbirds and bluebirds. But it's a showcase for their voices. Jazz at the Lobero really picked up after World War II. In 1953, Dave Brubeck appeared, and in the following decades, the Lobero helped introduce a new style of jazz called West Coast, or cool or smooth jazz. Year after year, the Lobero is named one of the world's great jazz venues by Downbeat magazine. Marian Anderson's performance is really especially poignant. No one in the audience knew that just a couple of months earlier, she had defied Nazi death threats and given a farewell, sold-out performance in Vienna, Austria. And then she left Europe and came to America and came right to the Lobero. From the 1920s to the 1940s, the Lobero was a favorite venue for theater previews. The Santa Barbara audience was considered to be sophisticated and have a good sense of humor. And producers like David O. Selznick used the Lobero to preview plays before opening them in Los Angeles on the East Coast. And looking back at all of the events at the Lobero, I think this is the one evening I would choose if I could time travel to go back. July 30th, 1941, Ingrid Bergman is performing in a preview of a play called Anna Christie. And in the audience are people like Charlie Chaplin, Alfred Hitchcock, Ronald Colman. And what's especially poignant about that is that looking back, July 1941, December 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked. The Hollywood Golden Age effectively comes to an end. Lobero performances really helped jumpstart the careers of an incredible number of legendary Hollywood stars, like Ingrid Bergman, Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, Betty Grable. She was 16 years old when she appeared at the Lobero. Bing Crosby, Lucille Ball, Glenn Ford. His career began at the Lobero, as did Tyrone Powers. So that's a recap of some of the Lobero's most famous moments. But the Lobero is not just a place where the famous perform. Unlike most of the other historic old theaters, it's also always been a community theater. From Jose Lobero's brass band in the 1870s to partnerships today with local arts organizations like CAMA, the Music Academy, Opera Santa Barbara, State Street Ballet, Santa Barbara Symphony, State Street Ballet. My favorite example of how the Lobero is a venue for both the famous and the not yet famous would be from 1998. Audiences were treated to 5 consecutive nights of Mikhail Baryshnikov, quite unprecedented, followed the next week by something called The Three Little Pigs, the Ballet, starring local school children. You're not going to find this at the Pabst Theater, Carnegie Hall, but you will find it at the Lobero Theatre. There's one more superlative about the Lobero that absolutely has to be shared. In July of 2023, the Lobero was named one of the world's 11 most beautiful theaters by Architectural Digest magazine. The list includes Walt Disney Hall in Los Angeles, the Harbin Theater in China, the Sydney Opera House, the Palais Garnier, the Paris Opera House. I mean, each of these places more incredible and spectacular than the next. And then coming in at number 11, we have our little Lobero Theater. I mean, we're lucky that they did a top 11 list, not just a top 10 list. When I saw this, I think most people's reaction was, seriously? How can this possibly be true? But then it sort of started to dawn on me. I started to understand the Lobero is a masterpiece of simplicity. The building that George Washington Smith and Luther Maria Riggs designed is just perfect in its proportions. It's understated. It's really the opposite of the Palais Garnier, but a fitting addition to the list. And I want to finish by sharing a short film about some of the performers who have appeared at the Lobero in its 151 years now. Thank you. Thanks so much.